Good afternoon. Um, Welcome attendees. My name is John Tasuda, and I'm a distinguished fellow with the Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Thank you for joining us today for our panel on Class 2 Gaming, the Math Behind the Machines. This panel is presented by the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance Program at the Boyd School. Just as an intro, Class 2 machines have become a mainstay at many tribal casinos. Right? While these machines may look to players as very similar to modern slot machines, they are distinctly different in terms of game design, architecture, and the applicable law. And probably the most important distinction being the math behind how the games are presented. In our webinar today, Russ Witt of Eclipse Gaming Systems will discuss the significance of the regulatory line between Class 2 and Class 3 machines and how Class 2 machines are designed around the game of bingo to ensure that they comply with federal law and regulation. My role it will be to serve as the moderator today. However, I'm going to offer just a few brief introductory remarks to the topic, and then I'm going to turn it over to our real expert, Russ. At the conclusion of his remarks, we will have some time for some questions from the audience. I will moderate those um, questions with the assistance of our program staff, Steve Isaacs, and we'll try to make sure everyone gets a chance to get that has a question to get their question answered and to respond. For those in the audience, if you do want to ask questions, I ask that you pose them in there's a Q&A tab, should be on your screen. If you can pose your questions there, they will then be presented in a queue for us to bring up at the end of the session. Technicalities passed. Let's get into our panel. Today, our expert is Russ Witt. Russ serves as the Chief Business Development Officer for Eclipse Gaming, a manufacturer of Class 2 systems and games based in Duluth, Georgia. In his current role, Russell is responsible for leading the strategic growth initiatives for Eclipse in the areas of Class 2, electronic table games, historical horse racing systems and hardware, as well as third-party studio game content. Previously, Russ has also served as a senior vice president at Paramax and Incredible Technologies, both companies that have been leaders in strategic development of Class 2 games, historic horse racing systems, and the hardware associated with those. In addition to his role with Eclipse, Russ has served as a member of the NIGA Class 2 subcommittee at the direction of NIGA Chairman Ernie Stevens to work with the NIGC to successfully revise the Code of Federal Regulations 25 CFR 547, Part 547, minimum standards for Class 2 gaming grandfathered systems. Russ has also served as a principal technical consultant to the National Indian Gaming Commission on the drafting of the Class 2 technical standards, all important to Class 2 gaming and to electronic Class 2 gaming that we'll discuss today. As you can tell, Russ is one of the industry leaders on Class 2 technical standards and internal controls and provides frequent trainings and participates in panel discussions around the country. So let's begin. For current observers of the Indian gaming industry, they may be surprised to learn that Indian gaming did not spring out of the ground as full-blown casinos and resorts. In fact, Indian gaming began in bingo halls with physical paper and ink dollars. When the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was enacted, nearly all of Indian gaming was bingo and associated games like pull tabs, which came to be called Class 2 gaming under the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. The act also opened the door for Class 3 or casino-style gaming, and that became the focus of much of the early efforts as the industry advanced. However, to engage in Class 3 gaming, tribes have to enter into a compact or an agreement with the state in which a facility is to be located. Not all states were interested in agreeing to those compacts. In those states, tribes were generally confined to continuing to offer Class II games, primarily bingo and pull tabs. During the same time period, and I'm going to take a little liberty here in the sort of legend and myth building history of gaming, as we often do, and combine a lot of stories that I have been told by original producers of paper bingo and the movement into electronic bingo, and try to condense this into a very short storyline about how paper bingo got to electronic bingo. So in the same time frame as the development of IGRA, late 70s through the early 90s, the game of bingo went through a lot of technical advancement. These technologies began to show up in a lot of places: Elks Lodges, Catholic charitable bingos, tribal bingo halls. While initially aimed at assisting disabled and physically challenged players, bingo hall operators quickly saw there were great advantages for all players. In fact, players could use these electronic aids to play a lot more cards at one time than they could when using paper bingo cards. Eventually, tribal bingo hall operators and the growing software and hardware industry crossed paths. Working together, they brought forward the concept that bingo could be played more efficiently using electronic aid, and that play could be more exciting for the player if it looked somewhat similar to a slot machine. Not everyone was excited by these industry advancements. In particular, the U.S. Department of Justice and several states' attorneys generals filed legal challenges. After years of litigation, though, one principle came out that has been important to the advancement of Class II, and that was that, as the Department of Justice had expressed in other contexts, the principle that an underlying activity, if illegal, cannot be made legal by a change in the medium, and that the reverse of that should be true. So, for example, the possession and distribution of child pornography through the U.S. mail is illegal. The Department of Justice had argued at the early stages of the development of electronic mail and then the internet that distributing this same child pornography through electronic mail or through electronic means did not make it legal. It remained illegal despite the change in medium. So for our context, if paper bingo was legal, then changing the medium of the bingo to an electronic format did not make it illegal. Again, after years of litigation, this principle kind of came to a consensus position and has allowed the continued technological development. However, keeping bingo game electronic aids to this standard has not been easy. As I noted, the medium can change, but the game format cannot. So to pass muster, the electronic aid must still be part of an actual bingo game. This has meant, of course, that people with creative game design and mad math skills, such as our speaker today, are crucial to the continued success of Class II game development. So, having said that, Russ, without further ado, I'll let you proceed.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate the intro and the background you provided on that. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. As John said, today we're going to be focusing on the math behind the machines, but also taking a little bit of a detour in explaining kind of how the systems work and leading up to that, and really focusing on the differences and how to understand like what a Class II game is and what makes it Class II from the math and how it works and where the game is played, and then how that relates to a Class III game and what those differences actually are there. So we'll get moving. So on the quick overview today, we're going to be looking at the definition of Class II gaming system and the terminology. How does the gaming system actually work? All the components that work together in the system. How does the game actually play? And then also when you look at Class II, what are the patterns and those probabilities of those patterns coming out, which really determines the outcome and the win amount in the game. And then really what Class II and Class III are and what those differences are and how to spot those. We're going to talk briefly about the different types of bingo that are out there. And you'll hear this if you look at different regulations, both federal and at state levels. So you'll see terms like instant bingo, bonanza bingo, and then class two bingo. Some people refer to it as session bingo. So there's a lot of different terms out there for the different types of bingos that are out there. Touch briefly on kind of what gets tested when we look at the systems, and then looking a little bit at the certification report side of things. I know we don't have a ton of time. It's gonna be a lot to cover. I know that they're going to put this up. I think this is recorded, so we can go back and look at it if you wanted for reference from that standpoint. And I'm not sure, John or Stephen, but I'm happy to provide the actual overview of the PowerPoint, so we could actually send that out to anybody that would want it as well.
Great.
So when we look at a class two gaming system, so the Class 2 gaming system itself is comprised of multiple interfaces that are linked together, where the game of bingo is played in traditional form of bingo, but from electronic state. And as John said, when we look at court precedents, um, if bingo was legal in the paper form, bingo should be legal in the electronic form. And some of the early case law and stuff that I've learned from John in the time that I've known him and being a part of that Class 2 standards committee, started to learn some of the prior case law and how that was argued of, plain meaning approach to bingo. And this is no different than the bingo that was played by, our parents and grandparents. And it was just all those paper components are now just done electronically. So the game requires a minimum of two people to start the game, as we know, that must compete against each other for a common set of prizes. That's probably, if anything had to be kind of the foundation or the rock of what bingo is player v player, not player v machine. So class three is player versus the machine. Class two, you're playing against someone else, either physically present or someone else in another location, connected that way through a ball call. So you're competing against each other for a common set of prizes. That's the plain meaning definition and probably the rock of what really bingo is. The bingo balls are called electronically. They're drawn electronically, and the prizes are claimed electronically. In a paper game, right, you'd be sitting there with your dauber and actually doing all those physically on your own. Those acts are all now handled by the system. The numbers are displayed electronically and covered electronically, so you actually see the bingo happening on the display, where that could be located on the screen or maybe on the iDeck. So a lot of companies are getting, to be able to put that in different places, have different color coordinations for that. So the bingo game itself is actually played on the server, and that's a very important component because in a class three game, you're playing against the logic inside that machine. In class two, your electronic player interface is just your medium to connect to what's happening on the server. So everything happens at the server. You purchase your bingo card, the bingo card is evaluated, prizes are won or lost and determined at the server, and then those results are displayed back to you. So your electronic player interface is really just a medium for you to connect to the server where everything is happening. And the reels or the video representations on your screen, on the player interface, those are for entertainment purposes only. So what you see on the screen is basically what the game or the manufacturer wants you as far as your entertaining display goes. That's a visual representation of the physical bingo pattern and the amount of credits that you won on the server. So when we look at a Class 2 gaming system, it's really comprised of several key components. This is more of a general overview. It's not how every single system is designed, but every system out there has a minimum of these components and system components that all play together to aid in the play of one or more Class 2 games. So obviously most important, starting first, is the game server. So that contains your random number generator, all your pay tables or any of your payback percentages of what that game will actually pay back to the patron, and your game themes and or skins. In class two, when you go into casino and you see a vendor and you see multiple games from that vendor, a lot of times, even though there's different graphical representations and art on that game, they're typically tied back to one or more math models. So in the industry, we call them skins or themes or clones. So you'll have a game and a math model, and then you'll have other games that are art, aesthetic changes, but playing the same math model. The report server, so all the information that is gathered in the game also goes back to a report server that the Class 2 gaming system has as part of one of its components. So that will have all your game reporting, all your metering functionality, coin in, coin out, ticket in, ticket out information, anything along those lines, bonusing, player tracking information, anything that the system would send to the casino's online accounting system. It also sends a copy of that back to the report server. That makes Class 2 very unique to Class 3 because Class 2 manufacturers can see that information in real time. So that actually really helps us to know if a game is actually playing well, if a game is not playing well. So we can look at that, and it really helps us from a development standpoint. We can see things quickly, we can pivot and change that way. So it actually really helps us from a design standpoint. If we make a change to a game and we think it's going to be an enhancement to make the game more fun and appealing to the player, we can see if that's actually driving the coin in, and it's actually driving the hold of the game, or if it's not. So we can kind of pivot and say, "Ooh, that idea worked. We're actually seeing the results of it," or "Oh, that idea is really not working. It didn't make the change that we expected," and we can kind of pivot from there from a development standpoint. And also the electronic player interface. So that is the actual terminal that you sit at. In Class 3 or commercial gaming, you would call that a slot machine. In Class 2, it's actually an electronic player interface because that's not the only way that you can interact with a game of bingo. So that includes terminals, player stations, handheld devices, fixed units. So when we talk bingo, we're talking broad about paper, electronically aided games of paper, and then the full electronic Class 2 gaming systems that we see today that look, feel, and play very similar to a slot machine, but those are considered electronic player interfaces. Another major component is the management terminal. So the management terminal will have pay table or payback percentages if they're not in the game server. They'll also have your game types, the different types of ball calls that you could actually run, and any verification of system versions and signatures. That's really important for the operator. So when you get a letter of certification from an independent testing laboratory, they'll have the versions and signatures and all the pertinent information the regulator needs to validate that that game is actually what was tested in the laboratory, and all that will be handled in the management terminal. And last but not least is the voucher systems. So prior to Class 2 games, as John said, maturing and kind of growing into these larger full-scale tribal casinos that exist around the country, the systems had to do their own vouchering systems. So you would go into a facility many years ago, and instead of having one casino interface system that you would put your player card into, each manufacturer had their own vouchering system that they there was varying degrees of what the system could actually do. Some could just do vouchers. Some could also do player tracking. Some could do bonusing. But you would basically pull your ticket out of a certain manufacturer. You'd walk over to the cash cage. There'd be a KVM switch there and say, okay, what company did you just cash that out from? And they would scan that on a certain barcode scan. There'd be a drawer or a till to be able to pay you from that. So depending on how many manufacturers you had multiple windows or multiple tills to pay individuals from. So those systems still have those features. Obviously, they're not utilized today because all the casinos will have their own back-end system, but that technology is present and does still exist within the systems. And this is just a kind of a graphical representation overview of what the system actually looks like. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So just in a high level, so you've got your Class 2 game system, right? So all your components are in there, your report server, your management console. Those are connected through cabling to a closet switch that then goes out to the bank switch where you have your actual machines. There's a smart interface board, SMIB is what we call that. That connects back to the accounting system that works with both the ATMs and the kiosk bill breakers that are out on the floor. So a Class 2 gaming system will talk out to the accounting system, but it'll also talk back to its own system that's housed on property. Those servers sit inside of an IT room that's secure, and it's under the security and direction of a tribal gaming regulatory authority. So very limited access to those rooms. They're secured. There's a sign-in process. So if a technician or an engineer from a manufacturer comes on site, they would obviously have to be badged, be able to be escorted in there to do the work that they want to do. You can also do that work remotely. So most every manufacturer has like a network operations team. Those individuals are also licensed, and when they log in, those sessions will be captured and key logged to make sure that you're doing the work that you're supposed to do and not doing anything nefarious or anything along those lines. So both ways that you could actually enter those servers, those individuals need to be licensed, background checked, vetted, things of that nature. This is also just a representation that I found that was on the NIGC site. So very similar to the drawing that I created. So it shows, again, your game server, your report server. You show it communicating to the online accounting system, and the game's actually talking back to the closet that way. So class 2 systems are talking in two directions, where a class 3 game would just be connected back to the online accounting system in the facility. A class 3 game would not have its own report server or game server or things of that nature. All the logic for that game would be housed inside the CPU unit that is locked and secured inside the game. So when we look at a couple different types of bingo, so we have live call or session bingo. So live call is so a player wagers the required amount of credits to purchase a bingo card by pressing play on the button located on player interface. The game server then searches for one or more players on the system to begin a game. Again, going back to the minimum of two players. When a minimum of two players are available and they both have purchased bingo cards, the system will then enroll them in a game inside of a bingo session and start the ball draw sequence. So the first person who daubs a winning prize pattern is awarded those credits for obtaining the pattern in accordance with those prize rules. So those prize rules are typically on either on the pay glass, if it's an older style kind of three-reel game, or they're in the help screens within a game if it's a more modern video representation of that game. So those interim prizes is really what the majority of the players are playing for, and those are the prizes with the highest amount of values on them. The players are also playing to achieve a bingo pattern that is the game ending pattern. There's typically a very small de minimis monetary value on that, which basically begins and ends the game. That's really the biggest difference between a physical paper bingo game and this representation of an electronic class 2 bingo game. In class 2, the players are typically competing for a large number of interim prizes that are evaluated early on in the ball draw. And the game ending prize, which would be a coverall or a blackout for people that have played bingo, has a very small monetary prize on it. In paper bingo, we're typically just playing for one prize, which is the game ending prize. So once a player has won a prize, that is then translated onto the screen in an entertaining display that translates that bingo pattern and win into something that the player can recognize. So real spinning and stopping on a pay line or triggering symbols that take you into a bonus game or something along those lines. But all of that entertainment component of it is predetermined. So if the player won a pattern for a set number of credits, say 1,000 credits, the system will decide and find through its lookup table, which the lookup table is basically just comprised of winning outcomes that can be displayed. So the system will then display an entertainment value to the player that dings up to 1,000 credits. So it could be a base game win that goes into a bonus win or a wheel spin or a pick 'em or something like that. But once that actual entertaining display is done, it would ding up the 1,000 credits that they won for the pattern. So a quick overview of what the interface actually is for class 2, and this will really show you the difference. So This is kind of a simple like three reel game, but it's easy to kind of understand what we're talking about using this. So you have your bingo card that is displayed somewhere on the game. It could be on the screen in different locations. It could be on a secondary screen, or it could be on the actual like integrated iDeck on the machine. Just depends on where the manufacturer decided to put that. Then you also have your entertaining display conversion table, which shows you how many credits are won for those graphical representations. Those actually translate directly back to bingo pattern outcomes. And then you have your entertaining video display. So again, when you win your bingo pattern, the reels are going to spin. It's going to land on a winning pattern, and it's going to display that to the patron. And then you also have your ball draw outcome. So not only will you see the bingo card, and you'll see the bingo card will be represented by different colors. So in this case, the white squares are balls that haven't been called yet. The ones that are represented in the pinkish purple color, those are balls that have been drawn. And then the ones that are actually highlighted in purple are ones that you actually had that were called and were winning numbers. And this is just a representation. So I took this right from our system. So in the game history, you will actually see, and it'll show you a graphical representation of what those reels look like. It'll show you what the game name was. Was this a progressive win or not? What the player's wager balance started with, what they wagered, what they ended with. Did they win? What the game number was, and then again, the bingo card unique ID. So typically we do have another screen that I didn't represent on here, but every single transaction that is recorded, there'll be a bingo session ID, which has a unique identifier. Then there's a bingo game ID, which also has a unique identifier. And then the bingo card ID, which will then have the patterns and what the pattern monetary value was. All that is tracked. A certain number of those are kept actually on the actual player interface, but everything ends up going back to the report server, and that information is stored there in the report server and pushed back out at a set time to an offsite data center. And I wanted to show you here, these are a couple of the games that we're working on. And I wanted to show you can see down in the left-hand corner, down where you see the win and the credit meters. We have our bingo cards displayed there. And right below that, you'll actually see the bingo ball draw happen on there. So any of the games from Eclipse, we typically have our bingo card down in the left-hand corner. The bingo ball draw will be right underneath that. So the player will be able to see not only their graphical representation or entertaining display on the reels, but they'll also see the winning pattern that they had on their bingo card and match it up to the bingo ball draw. So a question that we get a lot in class 2 is, are there bonus games or any other additional features? And yes, class 2 games do have bonuses. Class 2 games now are very advanced from a technological standpoint. They look, play, feel, sound very close, if not identical, to Class 3 games in the way that they're actually played. So bonuses are typical. Again, all the prizes are predetermined and part of the entertaining display process of showing a winning bingo pattern. So through that process, the credits from that bingo pattern can be displayed in a number of iterations to the player. So let's say a player won 2,000 credits. So we could display 1,000 credits in a baseline win. So if they won like triple sevens or 5 sevens, and then that triggered a bonus pick'em game where they went and picked on the screen and different symbols and won another 500 credits. And somehow that triggered a free spin. So they would win another 500 credits that way. So through that whole entertaining display process, the player is, being entertained and, they're having that winning feeling that they just achieved all of that win. But what they really did was win a pattern that equated to 2,000 credits. And then we decided to show that to them in 3 different entertaining displays that all culminated in the 2,000 credits that they initially won. So free games, yes, there's free games as well. Those can be awarded off achieving or triggering something in the base game for the entertaining display. So again, a certain pattern might equate to actual monetary value, or it could be a trigger to associate them for free games or things of that nature. So all those can be identified and linked back to patterns. And then the hit frequencies and things of that are determined when we actually go through and create the math model. Also, progressives, class two offers progressives. Same thing, there'll be those progressive prizes will be tied back to certain patterns. So when those are triggered, they can be local, they can be wide area, similar to class three. Just how they're actually contributed to, and one would be based on how that game and that math model was conducted. So when we look at a class two gaming system, so these are very important questions that determine if or it isn't a class two gaming system. So is the electronic player interface that we're actually playing bingo on, receiving its game determinations from a server which it's attached to? So if it is, you're playing a class two gaming system. If it's not, and you're playing against the logic inside that game, and it's not connected back to some sort of central determinant system component, then chances are you're not playing a class two game. Do a minimum of two players need to be present to initiate the gameplay? Again, very important. That's kind of the bedrock of class two. So you have to have two players to initiate a bingo game. One player can finish the bingo game, but two people have to start the bingo game. So, and is the math model of the class two game derived from a bingo ball draw? Again, the essence of bingo is two people, a minimum of two players starting the game, balls being drawn and evaluated for interim prizes and game ending prizes. Again, a critical component of if it's class two or not. And if the electronic player face is disconnected from the server, can I still play the game? If the answer is yes, then no, you're not playing a class two game. If you lose connectivity to the system in any way, shape, or form, the game of bingo will continue on. You will not be able to continue in that game of bingo. Your terminal will then come back to a known bingo state. And the way we constructed the regulations is the player will, at a minimum, get their wager returned to them from the operator. If they want to incentivize the player in any other way based on their level of play, or if they've got some sort of status, that's completely up to the operator. We call it the house rules. But at a minimum, you would get your wager back, just like in live call bingo. If you were playing bingo and you had to take a phone call or step away, bingo is going to continue. Even if you had the winning pattern, you would have to actually yell bingo. So if somebody else does it, you would sleep your win. In paper bingo, you wouldn't get your wager returned, but in class two, we would return your wager if you lost connectivity to the server. So here's another representation so you can see a little bit better. So you got the bingo card in the middle of the screen. At the top, you have your ball draw to the right. You can see the balls are drawn. You can see the ones that were daubed. Same thing on the card. So it really depends on the vendor of where they want to put that on the screen. There isn't a regulation that says you have to have it on the screen. Just all that information has to be present inside the game and the gaming system. But so many jurisdictions are so used to seeing the bingo cards that many require you to have them. Some regulators will allow the bingo cards to be toggled on or off as long as that information is readily available to be pulled back if there's a dispute. Typically, most manufacturers will create their system with three different configurations for that. Either the bingo card and display are always on, they can be always off, or they can be player selectable. So when we look at the class three side of things, so the primary source of the game outcomes for class three, they come from using real strip stop positions. So what you see on the screen and what is displayed to you, those are the outcomes. There's no lookup table or anything along those lines. All the logic resides inside the cabinet. So you are playing against the logic inside the machine. It's not connected to any other system that way. There's no minimum player requirement. You can walk up to any class three game and play it because you're playing against the logic in the machine. And the gameplay is not contingent upon system connectivity. The only system that a class three game is connected to in the casino would be the online accounting system, which if you put your player card in, right, it's tracking your session, you're getting player points and things of that nature. You're able to download credits and things of that nature. If you lose connectivity to the system, the game will still play. It just won't capture your play for your points or your status, but you can continue to play if the system loses connectivity to the online accounting system inside the casino. So when we look at game probabilities for class two, so class two games employ math models and probabilities using a par, which is a pay table and real strip sheet in a similar manner to class three. So the class two par sheets are developed with bingo patterns. So a pattern could be a four corners, a cross pattern, an X pattern, a blackout pattern. All the different patterns that way would be represented in shapes or colors. Number of bingo balls, which the pattern is achieved within. That's very important to see what the hit frequency would be for that outcome. And the number of credits associated with each bingo pattern. Also, the frequency of that bingo pattern can be achieved within the play of the game. So in addition to that, the par sheets contain the following information that's pertinent to the game. So you have your game type. So it is a one line, three coin bet. Is it a ways game? Is it a 30 line, 40 line, 50 line game? And then also what the game version would be. So every iteration of the game will add on. So right now we're at version 1.1.2 in this example. So if we made modifications to this math model and resubmitted it to the laboratory for certification, we would then do a version 1.1.3. And then we would send that into the laboratory to say, from version 2 to version 3, or version 3 to version 2, here's what we changed. So when we look at the probabilities, so you're going to have your maximum game payout. So what is that? What is that optimum payout for the game after it gets through the whole game cycle? A description of the game that's going to have the base game. So what does the player see or do in the base game? What sort of bonus games or other features that the game have? Does the card have any free spaces or the game have free games? Are there progressives within the math model? Other game themes or skins that are available for this. So if we have a math model, so version 1.1.2 in the previous slide, there might be 5 or 6 games or clones that all use that same math model. So you walk into a casino and there's a multitude of games and you see they look different, they play different, they sound different, but the player is actually playing the same math model. So if you play game one and I'm playing game two, we're both playing on the same math model. So the game rules and entertaining display real strip layouts, those are actually in the par sheets as well. So your bingo payout table, so you have your pattern ID, the pattern name, the number of balls it takes to actually achieve that pattern, and the amount of credits awarded per bet. And also the probability of the of that award being achieved during the game. So when we look at class two math, again, you have your theoretical hold. So what your payout percentage is, what your theoretical hold, so what you want that game to get to. Is it an 8% hold for the house, 6%, 10%? What is the top prize award? The top prize pattern or odds, what the hit frequency of that is, of those patterns being achieved. What is the volatility of the game? And we'll get into that a little bit of what volatility means and what the confidence values are of that return. Any progressive game details, if it has that, bonus or mystery jackpots, if those are applicable as well, and what the game ending prize pattern configuration is. Typically, it's a blackout. It could be four corners. It could be anything that you want it to be, and what those interim bingo patterns are, and the name of the pattern, and when they're displayed. So here's a quick, kind of rough overview of that. So you have the pattern ID will have a number associated with it. It actually has a pattern name, so pyramid, dog bone, window shade, and then when will that pattern need to be hit? So the pyramid pattern in this would have to be hit within the first 27 balls drawn. And then if I bet the first level, second level, or third level, what will I achieve if I achieve that pattern in those number of balls? When you look at confidence values too, So the return to player on a game can vary greatly when a game just starts. So the confidence value grows or shrinks and gets closer to what that actual return to player will be, the more spins that the game actually plays. So when you first go to play a game and say somebody wins a jackpot on the first game, well, then that payback percentage is going to be completely skewed and be extremely high. But if that game starts and nobody's really hit any prizes of value, that payback percentage is going to be very low. So as you start to see as that number of plays increases, it's going to get closer to what the actual returns a player is going to be on those games. So that concludes the presentation and the training. Do we have any questions from anybody?
So it looks like we have one question here. I'll just read it to you, Russ. I don't know if you could see it or not, but it says, does the requirement for two players to initiate play on a Class 2 slot machine mean the machine connects to a broader network, or does it strictly require two players within the same casino's local network?
That's a great question. And that really would be up to the Tribal Gaming Regulatory Authority. They have final say over anything that is governed on play within their facilities or even outside their facilities. Uh, um, the way that I've always seen it and understood it and interpreted it from any Tribal Gaming Regulatory Authority is they're typically fine with a wide area connection. So as long as you can show them that I'm playing against you, John, and you're sitting in, a casino in Florida, and I'm sitting at a casino in Oklahoma, and you can show them that yes, like player one and player two are connected via this wide area ball call. If you can show that and prove that to the commission, they're typically fine with that.
All right, I hope that answers your question there. Any other persons that wish to ask questions, please put them in the question and answer session. Um, why don't so there was only one in the queue, so I will actually throw one to you, Russ. um, so when we talk about the math, maybe you could take a step back to those of us who have very little math education. When you say bingo math, what does that mean?
So when you look at bingo math as compared to class three math, right? So when you look at a class three game or a commercial slot machine, whatever name you want to call it, on a class three game, you have reel strips, right? So you either have a physical reel that has a set number of stops on it, or you have a virtual wheel on games that can have, any number of stops, it can almost be infinite. So when you're looking at combinations and when you're actually doing your math, you lay out kind of like your symbols in the game and what those values will be on those symbols. So how a how a pattern probability comes out for a class three slot or slot machine is depending on weighting those reels. So a a symbol that has a very high value, the more of those that you have on a reel, obviously the lesser the higher probability that will come out. If you want your top prize to hit within a certain frequency, one in every 800,000 spins or million spins, you then take those symbols off those reels, right? So you have to kind of play with that, play with your math, and kind of weight things that way to get the outcomes and the hit frequency you want. In bingo, you look at things and you say, I'm going to create the number of patterns that I need. So you start with the patterns rather than the real strips, right? So the patterns in bingo, we start with those patterns and we say, okay, we're going to put these values on these patterns, and then determining of how many balls that pattern can come out in, that's how you change your hit frequency and probabilities. So there was a manufacturer that had a game-ending prize that was the four corners pattern. So you had to hit the first four balls drawn in a ball draw. and cover that on your car, right? So they had to match. The probability of that happening is extremely rare, right? A couple million to one. So you can maneuver a pattern and figure out if I want this pattern to come out in, if you wanted a pattern to come out in, 10 or 12 or 20 balls, that's going to happen less frequently than if you get that same pattern in 25 or 30 or 40 balls that way. So from a math standpoint, you have a lot more flexibility in class two than you do in class three. Almost every mathematician that I've worked with loves working in class two because you can really do things that you're restricted from doing in class three in class two. And then again, on the entertainment side of things, you can build a lot more anticipation and things of that nature that make the game fun for the player where they think that they almost got that pattern, that they almost won something. Class two gives a ton more flexibility that way because you're not bound by what's on the actual screen. We can display anything we want to them, but how we actually create the values and what those payback percentages are and those probabilities are based first off of those bingo patterns. And then how we actually display that to them, we create that entire lookup table and have that stored and can display that to them. It's two completely different ways of doing the math that way. So in class three, you're actually bound by the symbols that are on the screen. In class two, we're determining the number of bingo patterns and when those can be achieved.
All right. So we've got a few more questions in the queue here now. So um, let me pose this one to you, Russ. How many different patterns does a typical class two machine have for their bingo math? Is
Um,
there a typical number?
There really isn't a typical number. I would say for most manufacturers will have thousands of patterns that they kind of have stored, within their math team. And I would say in a typical normal game, and again, I'm not speaking for every manufacturer, but I would say it's probably in the hundreds.
Okay.
And it really depends. Previously, I can definitely tell you this, it's grown significantly over the years as games have gotten more complex. And you look at like the modern feature sets of perceived persistence and all these other things that are prevalent in games now, and the more entertaining that games get, and the more complex of a game that you're actually creating, you can utilize more bingo patterns for that. You can do a lot of like free cards to basically connect people to different components within the game. So I would say probably hundreds is typical for a manufacturer. And again, right, as you hone in your hit frequency and how you want that to be, now that's creating a game from the ground up. A lot of games are class three or commercial slot machines that math is then converted to class two. So that would really depend on the complexity of that game of how many we would use.
Okay. Next question. Class two gaming requires at least two players to be connected. So does this mean at least two slot machines connected to the same game server? And what happens when one real player is playing at a machine and the other machine is left, he means, and the other machine is unattended? Does the game server in both machines does the game server send both machines balls for the same bingo game?
So typically you're you're not playing, it's not so dependent upon the actual game you're playing. It's if you're connected to the same ball call. So the actual ball call is agnostic of your game. So if it's a local ball call or if it's a wide area ball call, the ball call doesn't know what game you're connected to. It doesn't know what game you're playing. It doesn't know your pay table. It doesn't know any of that stuff. All it's doing is it's knowing that it's getting a request for a ball call from whatever that machine ID is. That could be local or that could be across the network. So it's connecting people to ball calls. And then in that ball call, you're using that outcome to actually evaluate patterns in the actual math model that you're playing.
Okay. Um, Next question. Do you feel that Class 2 math is desirable enough to players that a tribe could convert Class 3 compacted slot machines to total Class 2 so as to remove states' encroachment on tribal sovereignty?
Um, I would say the answer to that is yes. I would 5 years ago, would I be able to say that? Probably not. But the majority of the games that are in class two from manufacturers that aren't class two only manufacturers like us or VGT, other manufacturers take their top class three games and convert them to class two. So a tribe could, if they wanted to be all class two, could ask all of those manufacturers on your floor for those games in class two. And if the game is popular, it's going to be converted to class two. There have been games out there. I'll give an example. If anybody's ever seen that game, Sandbow, it's from Ainsworth. That game actually started as a class two game, became so good and so popular that they actually brought it to class three, which was typical not development for our industry. Usually it's most companies' mindsets are we make the games for class three because class three and commercial are much bigger markets. And when those games hit and they have something that's sustainable, then they say, okay, we're going to convert these top 6, 10 games to class two and bring those into markets that have class two. But yeah, the answer is a tribe right now, it really even doesn't matter on the number of games that you have. You could populate your floor probably 98% with all those manufacturers games in class two.
All right. Next question. Since its legality depends on it still being a bingo game, would a casino have any obligation to explain or make sure that the player understands that it is playing bingo? So for marketing, we should we use a broader term like game rather than slots, or is that not important?
It's not really applicable to the patron because one of the things from the class two technical standards that you have to display on the machine is you have to display two things. Malfunctions, void all pays and plays has to be there, and outcomes, game outcomes are determined by bingo. So those statements have to be somewhere on the game. Typically, they're kind of like printed out and they're like kind of like affixed to the game, or there could be like a placard on the game, or they'll be somewhere within the help screens.
Um, Here's a good question. Can you talk about the location of the servers? Does the server have to be on tribal property, or can it be located on a different tribal property? And maybe you can expand a little bit because you talked about several kinds of servers. Is there a distinction between servers and servers that would need to be located locally, or others that could be located on another tribal property?
I mean, typically, every manufacturer will have a server set that is local. So if you go into the casino, you will bring a physical server. Typically, it's a primary and secondary server. You have a switch. You have several other things there. You have a firewall. You have a APC backup. So that will go in and be installed in an IT server closet. Again, like we said, with that's locked and protected by the Tribal Gaming Regulatory Authority. So you'd have to be badged. You'd have to, sign in to be able to go in there and somebody would escort you in, typically a regulator and someone from security. Um, the wide area ball calls are typically somewhere where those are centrally located. Um, I haven't really seen a lot of manufacturers that are doing stuff kind of like over the internet that way, where they're basically having a server somewhere and it's communicating to another location where there isn't a server. Not to say we can't get to that technology, and it is available now, but a typical installation has a local server set. That server set will have a local ball call, but most manufacturers will also have a wide area ball call. A manufacturer will provide that information to the regulatory authority saying, we have a local server set We will connect those games to a local ball call server, but if in the event that there's only one player, we do have connectivity to one. They have a primary, a secondary, a tertiary, wide area ball call, and those are typically located in multiple locations. Typically, the manufacturer will provide that in their submission to the Gaming Commission for compliance and review. And they'll typically say, hey, here's the letter for my primary is located at, this tribal casino. My secondary is located at this tribal casino. My tertiary is at this location. And some tribes, maybe not all, they do have the ability to, will actually go and verify that. They'll call and say, hey, John, like I've got games in from this manufacturer. I have a letter that says you have a wide area ball call for them. Yes, I do. We check it, we test it, we verified the signatures and version numbers, so on and so forth. So many of them will go and do that due diligence and just check and make sure that, those servers are in fact there and under their purview.
That's a great question. So back to the bingo card. So class two uses a bingo card. How
Mm.
does that change? I'm not sure I understand the question. How does that change on the machine? So the machine only does a ball call to get the bingo numbers? Not sure I understand.
So the yeah, so the electronic player interface, when you hit play, you're making a request for a bingo card and to be entered into a game of bingo. Um, the actual card generation, the the actual software for that could reside on the actual server, but it also could reside on the actual electronic player interface. And I've seen it done both ways. So if it's on the electronic player interface, if you know anything about like seeding, each one of those player interfaces would have a different seed number. So they would actually create a bingo card that wasn't repeatable. So one of the things in the regulations is you cannot have the same bingo card with the exact same sequence of numbers. You can have the same numbers on you can have the same numbers on 1,000 cards that just can't be in the same sequence. So you can't have the exact same card with the same numbers in the same sequence in the same game. So the way that you avoid that is it either is done locally at the server to ensure obviously that the seeding happens that way, or at the player stations, it's seeded differently. So there's no way that the card could be repeated.
Great. All right. Any other questions? We're getting close on the end of our time here. We had some great questions. I think thank our participants for the questions. They certainly have helped expand the discussion a little bit. Um, I would go back, maybe if we don't get any other questions before the end, I would go back and ask you and maybe make a comment. The prior question about should you use something termed different rather than slots? Um, I know, as I mentioned in the introduction, in the early years of the development of electronic player stations and electronically developing bingo and the notion of an electronic bingo card. We had a lot of consternation by folks who were calling them bingo slots and things like that, which were terms that were sort of grabbed onto by opponents of electronic bingo to say that, oh, this is just a slot machine. They're calling it bingo, but it's really a slot machine. So, but in some regards, my history with that is, being one of the attorneys involved, I have a version of that. But do you think, I guess my question would be, Russ, is the industry now reached a point where it's more like talking about a Coke as opposed to a soda pop? Is the term become so fluid that it really doesn't matter anymore what term you use?
I mean, I don't think it really matters the term you use. I mean, again, being on that project with you and, just being involved in the creation of the regulations and kind of learning all the lineage and the history and the terminology. I mean, I always refer to them as like, they're not slot machines, they're player interfaces. But I mean, if a player or an operator, or they're going to advertise, we have the loosest slots, so on and so forth, what you call it, I don't think really matters too much from that standpoint because, as we saw in this presentation and what you and I know, you could easily go into that game and look at the bingo card, the bingo history, the ball draw. You can go into the game history and see all that stuff. So to the naked eye, especially if the bingo card was really small or if it was like on the player interface, it's hard to look at a game and determine if it's class two or not, but it's very easy to go into the help screens or to go into to one of the game administration screens and look at it that way. What you call it is what you call it, right? It is what it is when you actually get inside the system and look at it. So I don't see a problem with that. I mean, you and I know there was individuals, specifically one that we would get yelled at if we called it a slot machine. So I don't call it a slot machine. But I live in Oklahoma, so driving by and seeing we have the loosest slots, and yeah, this is my favorite slot to play. And you and I know that it's a vendor that's a class two vendor. It's it doesn't really, I mean, most of those individuals, they're not going to be or have to actually go into and and state under oath if this is class two or not. So I think really it pays homage to the class two manufacturers who have made games that are now so indistinguishable from class three, from the play, the feel, the look, the art, the graphics, the sound. Some of the top performing games out there now were, started as class two games. And that's great to see, from where they came from when they were definitely looked, felt, played, sounded way different. Now you look and you walk onto any, major tribal casino floor across the country, it's very hard to determine what is class two and what isn't. So that's a testament to the industry, the regulations that we were a part of, all the brilliant minds that work in this, the mathematicians, the game designers, the programmers. Yeah, it's come a long, long way, and it's beautiful to see.
I agree. Well, great. I think we're close to the end of our time. Thanks, Russ, and participants. That we had a great discussion. I really appreciate your presentation, Russ. Let me say also, we have a big thank you to the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, whose vision and support has made possible the establishment of the Indian Nations Gaming and Governance program here at the Boyd School of Law, and the things that we do through that program, including this webinar. For those in the audience, just to repeat, the webinar has been recorded and it will be posted on the school's website. I believe that several folks asked if they could have Mr. Witt's presentation or the screenshots, and so we'll check into that. But I believe Mr. Isaacs, we've done that in the past and been able to make that available on the website when people go to check out the video again. They should be able to download it off of there. Just check back maybe in a couple of days with us. So with that, we'll close this out. Thank you, Russ. Thanks, Mr. Isaacs, for helping us with this and for the participants. And I hope all of you have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.